Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Healthy X Sundays podcast, where we bring you the most critical and actionable content in the nutrition and fitness space. Dave from Mind Muscle Pro and I, Kunal Jain, also known as Veg Diet Coach, are your hosts. Today, we are joined by Mr. Yohan Tengra, a relentless health seeker whose journey from chronic health struggles to holistic wellness is nothing short of extraordinary. Over the past 9 years, Johan has navigated a personal health maze involving severe skin conditions, chronic fatigue, autoimmune battles in his family, and countless dietary experiments from veganism to keto carnivore and beyond. These trials not only shaped his understanding of health, but also led him to an unshakable purpose to empower others in overcoming chronic health issues through evidence based nutrition and diagnostics. Fueled by his insatiable quest for knowledge, Johan transitioned from a DJ and finance graduate to pursuing a degree in nutrition science and earning a certification in functional medicine. His hands on approach to wellness includes mastering diagnostics through advanced blood microbiome and genetic testing, enabling him to uncover the unique root cause of health issues. Today, he's not just a survivor of his health battles, he's a guide, helping others transform their journey by addressing the underlying causes of their ailments. Get ready for a deep dive into personal transformation, the truth behind modern medical systems, and the endless pursuit of optimal health. So, welcome, Johan, to the Healthy X Sundays podcast, and thank you for making time.
Hey, that's a really descriptive and perfect introduction. I've never seen someone put it that way. So thank you so much. You guys have done your homework for sure.
Thank you. Thank you, Johan. So, can you just tell about your journey in your own words, please? How did you start get here?
Sure, man. So it all starts like somewhere around 10 years ago. I used to struggle with a lot of chronic skin conditions since childhood. Since like eighth standard, I would have severe acne. First started on the face, then eventually went full body, went to the back mainly, and I would have like 30, 40 breakouts in a day at one point when it was at its peak. I also started having some weird extreme kind of dandruff in school, which kept escalating to a point where it started on the scalp, but it eventually spread to my face and my chest and everything. And I would have the fatigue bit didn't happen earlier. Like it started somewhere around in college, but then I would have drastic issues with that, like just feeling unrefreshed, just continuously sleeping nonstop, still waking up after 13, 14 hours, still feeling like I haven't slept. Then I had tonsillitis since childhood, so that always kept bothering me because I would have constant nasal drip, going on, and phlegm buildup happening continuously. Yeah, so those were the major challenges. I also had a very skinny frame, would always have difficulty putting on muscle. Tried separated by 5 years. Tried going to the gym 3 times. One of the 3 times I had a personal trainer, stuck with it for 4 to 5 months, still barely got any results. So yeah, some other stuff, but these were the primary complaints. It's coinciding with that. In the very beginning, I saw my grandmom go through dialysis for 2 years. So I was very close to my grandmom growing up, and then when she was on dialysis for those 2 years, it's almost as if she was not alive. She's just going to the hospital, coming, sleeping, and then again just same thing after 2 3 days again. So that had some impact on me. And then I also saw my father go down with myasthenia gravis. So that was quite shocking also, because he's on the ventilator for a couple of days at the peak of that. And then he survived and came back. So yeah, I never wanted to land up, in that position. So I was like, how do I do this in a way where I'm not really you know, doing it through the conventional route? Because I always had some skepticism towards that. I was starting to just kind of watch some documentaries and stuff at the time also. So that also made me, more skeptical about modern medicine and stuff, and their approach towards, addressing chronic disease and things. So yeah, put that all together, and it kind of fueled a quest to try to figure out how can I fix myself on my own, without actually, going to a dermat or a conventional medical doctor. So that eventually landed up making me explore all kinds of diets. I was a hardcore vegan for a year or two, and eventually kind of morphed into being a very like hardcore Mokola fan. So like was, doing keto for like three years almost, like 1.5 year of continuous nonstop like ketosis with plant foods and everything. Then like even that like kind of made my skin conditions worse. I would like go out in the sun, and I invested in infrared sauna. So I would get like sauna every day and then go out in the sun, and it made my like sebderm much worse. On keto and both on vegan, like I would do, of course, like both diets would feature coconut, like a keto more so, like, but even a vegan diet would have like coconut in the dishes and stuff. And then like the vegan diet, the dairy was ditched. But with carnivore, like even the dairy, like, I mean, the keto, with even the dairy came in. So both the diets, like, I mean, I now know that I severely react to coconut and dairy, but I didn't know it back then. I only figured it out once I did a carnivore diet, because that's when I figured in the reintroduction that these foods were like the issue for me. But at that time, I wasn't, really aware about that. So both the diets like made my skin conditions much worse. Keto much more so, because I was doing dairy and coconut both without like really realizing it. So that led to like much more breakouts, like tremendously like more breakouts than I would have earlier. But like my fatigue got a bit better on keto, and like my mental kind of acuity and sharpness like really peaked. So I thought it's doing something good, because and those things were like, I kind of came up with some reasons, like when you're really convinced with a diet and you're like looking up to someone, you come up with reasons to kind of justify like why something would be happening. So I was kind of like downplaying that and thinking, "Ke theek hai, like at least this is getting better or whatever." So,
Mm-hmm.
but yeah, I would always try to keep like figuring out, keep researching more. Even when doing that, I finally gave up on it, because it like really like made the problem bad to a point where like others were like noticing it more and more. So then that like got me towards doing the carnivore diet, because that's when like Michaela Peterson and stuff were getting like popular, with her coming on Joe Rogan and stuff. So I did the carnivore diet, and that's when I figured out like my food sensitivities after that, because I severely reacted to coconut, even coconut water. Like the day I added like coconut, I noticed like insane itching, which had gone away for some time. And then like even with dairy, I saw the same thing. Like I had like raw milk after, like cutting it out for a long time. And then I saw like a proper flare up. So that helped me a lot in figuring that out. But the other stuff was like still on the table. Maybe the diets like helped, 20-30% with everything, but all the other symptoms were like still there. Even with carnivore, like the problems, didn't go away as such. It just gave me some kind of like reduction in symptoms, so I could notice like it coming back in an aggravated way, but it didn't really go away. So that's when I was like, fuck this to be like politically incorrect. I have to really like pursue this academically and figure out what the hell is going on, because this is not really making any sense. So that's when I like chose to invest in, like some functional medicine courses from the US, like studied for 2 years, and then got a firm understanding in like blood chemistry interpretation. Firm, I thought at the time. Like now, with my current understanding, I would look back and think like I was probably like 20-30% of the way there, even with that. But yeah, I figured that out. Then I just like kept wanting to understand more and more about diagnostics. I got really passionate about it. So I kept, like learning about different tests like genetic analysis and like gut microbiome analysis, metabolomics, like amino acids, organic acids, and stuff. So put that all together, and then by that time I started working at a healthcare startup. I worked there for 3 years as the knowledge officer. So basically like teaching them whatever I learned for like that long, and helping to integrate whatever knowledge I had, like to translate into patient outcomes. And sometime early this year, I branched out into my own venture. So yeah, since like early this year, I'm just focusing on my own practice. I see patients every day with all kinds of chronic health conditions, and I launched my course like 5-6 months back. So yeah, like just teaching people, and passionate about like getting this stuff out, so we can really make a like dent in people's lives, like not make people waste time, save people money as much as possible, and really like transform people's health, because we do know a lot about like fixing a lot of stuff. The problem is just like lack of knowledge and lack of application of that. Yeah.
Amazing.
Right. Uh, so you are a like today's discussion is about integrative testing, and you are a huge proponent of bio testing. So, what are the biomarkers an average person should look at, or what are the biomarkers you look at in a client? Is it dependent on the case, or how does it work?
Sure, man. Good question. So I typically start out with a very comprehensive panel, which like gives me very like important biomarkers to look at, which are very, very well validated. When I say well validated, I mean like a lot of, not just like one or two, small studies, but like large long-term prospective cohort studies, like on each marker, well adjusted, showing like strong associations between like you going outside the range in both directions with, intensifying like a risk of all-cause mortality, of cardiovascular mortality and stuff. So I've been studying like the research on, like each biomarker for a couple of years and like collecting all of that. So I've compiled like my own, like evidence-based optimal reference ranges, which are staggered. So you get like a green, and you get orange, you get a red. So it's not just like you're outside the range, but you get an idea about the degree of dysfunction with the percentage variation, like that you're going away from the center. That way. So that helps a lot in prioritizing, because like a lot of people do blood work and they'll just see like they're outside the range and stuff, so they'll assume like, okay, these markers are a problem. But yeah, this has become like more kind of well understood for me, that that's a bit of a short-sighted approach, because I was doing that for a couple of years, and you wouldn't be able to rank people's issues, with just that. So I figured that, okay, we need to really get an understanding of like how to rank the issues, and that would be solved if we just kind of got an idea about the percent variation. So I spend my time like actually, trying to make the reference ranges in that way. So with that, and also like trying to focus on the most evidence-based biomarkers, because a lot of people like test for things, and then a lot of these tests, which even I use some of them, but they wouldn't like rank high in terms of how much utility they have. I mean, they can be useful to confirm other diagnosis, or a hunch I might already have about like something looks a certain way, but the markers are not very solid in that. There's not a lot of like data or studies, showing that they actually, mean something. Like some of the examples would be like a lot of the markers in the organic acids, and even some things in the blood test, like they're not very well validated or studied. So like separating that and like keeping that lower down, and like focusing on the most important ones, which can tell us a lot. So within that whole spectrum, like in the blood work, I'm testing for around like 140 different ones for anyone who comes in. So that includes many important things, like depending on the system you're looking at. If we talk about cardiovascular health, then ApoB and lipoproteinemia, like some of the most important. HOMA-IR gets calculated from like fasting glucose, fasting insulin. That's quite important. Like hemoglobin levels and thyroid, like free T3, free T4. I screen for antibodies in everyone, so I get like anti-TPO, anti-TG antibodies. In arthritis, we get like RA factor and anti-CCP. So that helps me to like pick up like autoimmune thyroid, or like arthritis related like joint issues or stuff, like years before it starts, because we have good research that like these things, the antibody starts to go up like a couple of years before the actual dysfunction in the organ starts. So I screen for those antibodies. I screen for all heavy metals in the kidney section also. Like there's a lot of understanding now that we can actually prevent kidney decline if we look at certain markers and like try to maintain them. So with that, like blood pressure screening, like glucose and like diabetes risk screening, and also metabolic acidosis, which is not given a lot of importance, or like it's not well known by a lot of people, but looking at bicarbonate levels, and if we screen for them and if we maintain them, we can actually like slow down the deterioration of the kidneys on a daily basis. And it's been shown that like bicarbonate supplementation and improving bicarbonate levels can actually delay dialysis, like in long term studies and stuff also. Other than that, like there's a ton. Like I mean, it depends on like how deep you want to go into it. But there's RDW, there's albumin, even in like glucose markers. I won't just do like a basic screening. I look at fructosamine. I look at the glycomark. So these are all like tests which don't. So HbA1c just gives you an idea about like your 3 month glucose control, but with glycomark you get like 2 days to like 1 to 2 weeks kind of idea about how much your postprandial glucose is rising. So with that literature, we know that going above 180 consistently is bad, which is it's not to like demonize glucose spikes as a whole, because if you're like doing under that, there's really no research to show that that actually leads to like any kind of health outcomes. But if you're consistently going above 180, then we do have research with the glycomark showing that it actually translates into bad outcomes. So I screen for that. I screen for fructosamine. Just looking at fructosamine by itself is not so valuable, because like it's affected by many more things, like the albumin value. Like if it fluctuates, it will affect the fructosamine result. Fructosamine is supposed to reflect like 2 weeks or so of glucose control. So when you're making, like, if a patient comes to you and they have issues with insulin resistance or prediabetes or diabetes, and you're making changes, like, you don't want to wait for like 3 months for the HbA1c to kind of like pick up issues. You can pick it up faster with some of these things. So then, like, for some of these markers which are not so valuable, just like that, there are adjustments which you can make, which can make them more accurate. Like, you can adjust for fructosamine with albumin. Like, there's studies which look at doing that, and like, that's how, like, we get more accurate kind of diagnostic value from fructosamine. With iron, I won't just look at serum iron, TIVC, but I'll also look at ferritin. Sometimes even ferritin can be misleading because like, ferritin gets affected by inflammation, so you have to adjust for CRP. So just this year, a paper was published on, like, the ferritin to CRP ratio. And, like, so if you just take your ferritin, if your CRP is above 5, and then you divide your ferritin with your CRP, if the number is under 6, then that means you have an iron deficiency. And even the ferritin reference ranges, like, there's a lot of misunderstanding. Like, the conventional reference ranges, would wait for you to go under like 15 or 12 for you to, like, get diagnosed with the proper, iron deficiency anemia. But there's some clinical bodies which, like, collected all the, like, reference range research for ferritin, which showed that even when you start going under 45, also, like, it's a sign that your iron stores are depleting. And then once you go into 30, it's even more kind of intensified. And once you go into 12, it's like a very serious iron deficiency, to a point where your red blood cells and stuff will start to get impacted. So there's a lot of nuances, like, around even the markers that we test for. The conventional reference ranges, like, are an absolute mess. Like, I mean, they can pick up, like, serious issues, but to pick up, like, early dysfunctions and problems, and even, like, within the reference ranges, there's, depending on how high they go, there's research on, like, what it means. So for CRP, for example, like, if you're between, like, 3 to 10, it means a certain thing. If you're between 10 to 50, there are certain outcomes that are likely with that. If you're above 50, then it's almost like for sure confirmed that you have a serious, like, bacterial infection. Otherwise, it wouldn't go above 50. For viral infections, it seems to be somewhere between, like, 10 to 50. So even within the markers, there's, like, a lot of knowledge on, like, how high you go and what it means. Like, same thing for alkaline phosphatase, GGT, like, depending on how high you go, if you go to a certain degree, then it can indicate, like, that you have kind of issues with your gallbladder or cholecystitis and stuff. So I'm just, like, kind of researching every day and, like, finding out all the information on the markers, and then integrating that, and then teaching that to my students in, like, a very in-depth way. Yeah, so that's
Right.
just a bit of a summary.
So one of the convenience of being in India is that you can just go to a lab and get some tests done, which is not possible in places like the US. But there's always this question of the quality of testing. So what are your thoughts on this? Like, without naming any lab or something, could you tell us, like, what should we look out for when you're finding a lab?
No, actually, I have, like, kind of stress tested all the labs out here. So this was an issue for me going back, because in my, like, early keto days, like, I would use Thyrocare a lot, and like, some of the results would kind of line up with what I was facing. Like, I had arsenic overload issues, so that would constantly, like, reflect properly from test to test. I had CRP issues, so that would be, like, picked up. My uric acid was, like, elevated, so that would come consistently high. But some of the things, like, really didn't make any sense. Like, my zinc, like, especially for mineral testing, like, you really want a good lab, because depending on, like, how they're running the assay, there can be a lot of variation with that. So for some of the minerals, like, the testing really didn't make any sense, like, whatsoever. So that always, like, baffled me a bit. And even for, like, some other markers, like, I started seeing variation with time, and it wasn't really reflecting what I was doing properly. So I got quite skeptical of that. And then I wanted to figure out, like, okay, I have, this information, but I really need the results to be solid. Only then can I actually apply what's in the studies to, like, my own case. Otherwise, if the lab is screwing up, then, like, there's no point really. So then I started, like, researching on, like, other labs, and kind of, like, how to get it still in a cheaper way, because the other companies which were a bit more reputed, like, they would have really expensive kind of costs. That way, like, whatever you're getting for, like, maybe like 4-5K with in a comprehensive panel with Thyrocare, it would cost you like 30K, 50K, depending on, like, which other lab you chose. So that's when I came across, like, RT scans, and like, I used them for a couple of years, and the results were, like, really reflecting exactly, like, what I expected them. I would make certain interventions, I would test, and they would move exactly in the way that I was expecting. So I just didn't want to like trust them. So then I ran like a stress test. So I just like I booked like samples from 12 different labs. I kind of like called my phlebotomist who I know personally. I told him like collect, tubes so I can give them to everyone. So he collected like a lot of tubes at the same time. And I just, whichever phlebotomist came from the lab, I just gave it to them. Like this is a tube, you don't have to collect it, but just like go take this and process it. So then I made all those results public also. So I was able to rank the labs in that fashion, that way. So like there were, I ran it from like 12 different labs. So like Aarti and Orange came out at the top. There were some other ones also that did very well, like Apollo, Manipal, True Test. Yeah, like this is just top of my head, but there were like a couple of other ones, like two other ones which did really, really well. And then there was sub that did like suboptimal. So I kind of graded them depending on the percentage variation that they differed. So I first figured out like, so Aarti and Orange like got all of the results like for, I think, 11 or 12 analytes that I tested, like within 5% variation, which is like very solid that way. We're testing like 12 different markers, and from two different labs, they're coming like within 5%. It's very like, solid. And then depending on like how much the analytes kind of diverged and how many of them diverged, I would kind of rank them that way. So yeah, the worst was Redcliffe. Like they got a lot of results, like very, very deviated outside. And yeah, but the best were like some of these. So that's why like I had to like spend a lot of money out of my own pocket to do this. But then I had to like kind of figure it out once and for all. And of course, this is just like one day, and like on another day it could be a bit different, whatever. Those caveats always there. But it gives you some idea about like the overall accuracy.
Right. Uh, you did mention about the grading of the lab
Of like,
results, like as in a functional range and an optimal range. So yeah, so should so people in our audience who are watching this, like what should they target? Like, should they target that so-called optimal range, or like is there a better way to do this? Because
can
they
you say the
they have no
part
idea
of
what.
do you mind saying the first part of your question again? Like my internet.
Yeah. So my question was that for people in our audience who are really not aware of this optimal range and functional range and all this stuff, so what should they aim for? Because they have clearly have no idea of what the range they should aim for. Unless they're working with a practitioner, they have no clue. So how do they go about things? Is there like a tool online or something where you can use?
Yeah, so firstly, like I would say, people like trying to do this themselves. The best thing would be to like, I mean, see, firstly, like I really don't think people should be doing this themselves, because from whatever I've learned, like after being in this for a couple of decades, like there's some basic things. I mean, like you can pick up which are like kind of common knowledge a bit, and they're still accurate. So I mean, it's like a marker to marker discussion. It's very hard to generalize it in that fashion. But if someone's just starting out, like let's say they get like a comprehensive, blood test done from any of like the popular labs. So firstly, of course, like try to choose the labs at least which like I mentioned. I'll just like mention the other ones as well, which I think are good. Like I'll just open it right here so that people like, yeah. So like Aarti, Orange, Manipal True Test, and then we have Apollo. Like these were like really, really good. These four were exceptional in terms of like how the results were. And then yeah, like the others were a bit suboptimal, and Redcliffe was really bad. So definitely don't go with Redcliffe. And if you're doing it, like try to go with one of these labs. I don't have any like financial kind of thing or anything going with them. I don't get anything like from promoting them either. It's just like purely like just for information, because I spend a lot of money like doing this just out of my own thing to kind of like make better recommendations for like what labs people should be using. So that's one. And then if you're doing like a comprehensive panel from either of these, then I mean, like as a layperson, you're only kind of equipped with, okay, you can just look at the range that's there on the lab, and if it's outside, then you can just try to make some basic changes. So for just in general, like I actually did like a masterclass on this. So it's just like for 1K, and I walk people through like the most kind of important actionable things on a general, like blood chemistry, and I give them like just reference ranges, which are not like staggered, but which are just like, optimal somewhat, and some interventions to make for that. So people should catch that master class. It's like just a 2-3 hour master class, but it will be like a proper initiation for someone who's just like new to this, and they can just start doing some basic blood work and like looking at the ranges in my slides and stuff and trying to make some changes based on that. So I've covered quite a few markers in that class, like creatinine and A1C and like some other like basic kind of things that can be easily kind of interpreted and which are actionable, and that's advice I'm comfortable like giving to like everyone in general. Like there's some things that really like depend case to case, but in that masterclass, like that's just basic stuff that can be implemented. And then like, I feel like a lot of people just try to jump for extreme things in the beginning without even like fixing the basics first. So the diet's not dialed in, the sleep's not dialed in, they're not managing the stress levels well, they're not getting like a bit of sunlight exposure every day, just like general things that we know that people should be doing overall, for like good health. So just start with the basics first that way, and then like try to go for some blood tests and like basic interpretation. And this is a never ending rabbit hole. Like it kind of depends on like how many issues you have or like how passionate you are about not just fixing your present symptoms, but also about preventing chronic disease in the future. And if your like passion level or interest level is very high, you can go as deep like as you want to in terms of like how much you really want to dig in. The perfect way to do this is to use staggered reference ranges. That way where, like you get a risk stratified idea with respect to like how out you are. So, I mean, like a CRP of, let's say like 3.5 would still show outside the reference range, but that's nowhere near a CRP of like 14. So like having that kind of knowledge also helps you a lot. And then especially with me, like I see a lot of patients like this year. I've seen like 250 or so people and different reports. So I get to see this like every day, like with different people, like their symptoms and history are a certain way and the biomarkers look a certain way. So I've got a lot of like understanding about like blood tests in a very experiential way also, like we're just doing that kind of thing. So that's where you want to reach ultimately in order to get like a proper diagnostics. And then there's some markers which can tell you a lot about like earlier risk. Like if you screen for your lipoprotein A levels early on, you have like serious genetic kind of potential for getting heart attack and like cardiovascular related issues later on in life. So some of these things are like really really important to know about early, so you can start making like appropriate changes early in life. But again, like this is a marker to marker discussion. I'm just giving examples top of my head.
So, Johan, when given your comprehensive analysis of biomarkers, your knowledge, so when you get multiple biomarkers with conflicting patterns, so then how do you prioritize the treatment approach for chronic diseases?
The conflict is just a result of a lack of understanding. This is what I would say after a long time from personal experience. I'll give you some examples also to make it really like interesting. So earlier I used to think that high kind of LDL and stuff is not a problem, and I was more on like the Paul Saladino, that side of the like internet with respect to like who I would follow and like what I would implement. So I always thought like, okay, if someone's LDL is high, but their HDL is proper, the triglycerides are proper, they don't have chronic inflammation and stuff, it's not a problem. Like it's okay. So I would kind of like reconcile it like that. But like now my opinions are like really, really solid on like ApoB and LDL being like really, really important to a point where it's like a direct kind of linear line with respect to like how high you go, even if you're insulin sensitive, even if you don't have chronic inflammation, even if you don't have metabolic syndrome, like still the ApoB like levels are super important, like even with all of that. And we know that because there are studies which even after adjusting for these things, we still see like straight line with kind of ApoB, LDL, and cardiovascular disease. Even in the trials where they look to kind of reduce ApoB, we see benefits. Like even when you stratify according to subgroup, you see like benefits regardless like whether someone's like fasting glucose is under 90, you still see benefits with lowering LDL. If their blood pressure is normal, you still see benefits no matter like how you stratify the subgroup with like whatever like exception you want to come up with. Like I have this, so this doesn't apply to me. Like it's not true. Like it's applicable regardless. So there's like a lot of confusion I would have. Sometimes, like I would actually think my result is wrong because I had like an optimal reference range, I got from somewhere. But then it turned out like my result was always normal, but the optimal reference range was wrong, that I learned. So that just like left me with like, TK, there's ton of shit in the industry as well, because a lot of people like will just, peddle something which is not really like, based on some theory or some mechanism they think is like, going on, but it's not actually based on some actual research showing that that particular range is, like if you go outside that, that's a problem. So some of these things really put me off. Like I would have these kind of issues in like, interpretation, which even made me scratch my head with like, okay, this really doesn't make sense, or what's going on. So once I really like got my head set to it, like I don't want to listen to any influencer, any like person who's like a secondary source. I just want to go to like the primary, literature and get all my opinions from there. So that's when I decided like, okay, I'm just going to read like the primary literature only, and only if something's coming from like at least like a well-adjusted observational study or a randomized control trial, only then like it's going to go in my template. Otherwise, I'm not really like, a lot of people have different views on, like they'll come up with random reference ranges for cortisol or like a lot of different things, that way. Especially hormones, like people will tell you your testosterone should be as high as possible that way, and it should be above like 800 or 900. But there's no like actual studies to support that. When I actually went into the research, there is like studies to support like there's benefit to being like above 630 to 750. 750 and beyond, like I haven't been able to find any single paper. And there are papers which show like a U-shaped association with testosterone. Like once you start going above 750, because of testosterone's impact on hemoglobin and clotting, and even like with its effects on DHT and that whole connection with prostate cancer, like we start to see mortality go up with like higher testosterone above 750. So, like it's just things like that which made me like, screw this, I just have to study this properly, because there's a lot of different opinions online, and like someone will spout one reference and someone else will say something else. So just to clear all that, I had to like dive in properly. And after like, doing this for a couple of years, like where I've reached now, there's no like confusion whatsoever. So even with like the lipid ratios, like with the cholesterol to HDL ratio, the triglyceride to HDL ratio, the HDL levels themselves, the triglyceride levels, like all those things, like it's not like contradiction with the LDL levels. Like you can have those being perfectly fine, but still your like LDL ApoB would be a problem if they are deranged. It doesn't mean that if you like increase the HDL with some supplement or something, like it's going to improve your cardiovascular disease outcomes. Because we have trials where this has been studied now, where like the pharmaceutical industry actually tried to develop drugs to increase HDL, because with all the observational studies first, they thought that there's a strong kind of connection, like the connection between with HDL and like cardiovascular disease was very compelling, because we would see it come up again and again. But then they try to develop drugs to increase HDL. They even use niacin in a lot of those trials. The niacin increases HDL significantly, and they didn't find any like risk reduction in cardiovascular disease. This is despite like them spending like billions of dollars, trying to develop new drugs like CETP inhibitors and things like that, and fibrates to increase HDL. So that's how we know like increasing HDL is not going to confer you like a benefit in terms of cardiovascular risk. The HDL being low, it does associate with cardiovascular risk, because it's reflecting other outcomes, like HDL levels decline with smoking, with chronic inflammation, with like couple of other things. Similarly, like there would be a contradiction with if I should be really lowering someone's LDL, because there's research showing that low cholesterol is like bad for the brain, and it like increases Alzheimer's risk, and like statin related like muscle pain and stuff we're familiar with. But even like there's a lot of people online who believe that low cholesterol is like a serious problem, and it will increase the risk of neurodegeneration, because it's needed for the myelin sheath, and it will screw your hormones up, because it needs like a backbone to produce testosterone and other hormones and stuff. But even that was like really really misleading, because we did a lot of trials since then. Like we started seeing associations with low like LDL or cholesterol and bad outcomes. But then once we started doing trials designed to like address those questions, like interventional trials, there's really no basis to much of that. Like the low cholesterol is actually a problem, because it's reflecting either someone has cancer, or someone has some infection, or like there's chronic diseases in which cholesterol levels decline. So they actually did a very innovative study where they looked at two groups of people who had like low cholesterol from baseline before entering the study and it stayed low, and then people who came in with a bit high levels, but then it like went low and like came back up. So only in like the second group where there were fluctuations, like it would drop and like, kind of come back, there they saw like increased risk. But the people who came in with like a low level and it stayed low, they didn't have any increases whatsoever. Then there are trials with like, they take people's non-HDL cholesterol and they see like a U-shaped curve. So non-HDL is like a bit of a better marker than LDL cholesterol because it like encompasses triglycerides, also in that. So they saw a U-shaped curve, and then once they made adjustments for, certain chronic diseases, like the U-shaped curve went away. It was like a straight line going up. So yeah, these were the kind of, like contradictory things that I had to like research a lot, like incredibly, like just keep nonstop, like finding papers, and then not just like find them, but critically analyze them, rank all the evidence together. And that's when I was able to resolve a lot of these contradictions that like common people would struggle with these markers specifically. Yeah.
So how do you you do a lot of research? So how do you find the right studies, or rather, how do you refine your studies? Because let's be honest, there's a lot of industries sponsored, industry funded studies out there as well. So how do you find out which ones to look out for, which ones to ignore?
See, like I spent like at least a month and a half, even in my course, like just teaching students about like how to kind of critically analyze scientific research and the factors to consider, like the quality of the studies, like which studies mean more about certain things than others. So funding is like one factor within like 100 factors you have to think about when trying to assess any study. So broadly, like we have a template for like how we rank studies. So anything that's done in like a cell or an animal, that's not really like translatable to humans. And unfortunately, a lot of online discourse is based on people just going by biochemical like pathways and mechanisms and like what's supposed to happen. Like, I'll give you a very good example. So a lot of people will tell you like omega-6 is bad for you because like they'll show you like the pathway, and they'll tell you like, okay, linoleic acid like uses these enzymes to kind of get converted to arachidonic acid, and arachidonic acid is really inflammatory. That's the narrative. Like, I mean, I don't believe this, but I mean, that's the common narrative out there. And then there are theories for like the omega-6 to 3 ratio and how like that should be under a certain number, because if that goes up, then there's increased risk of chronic disease, implying that like more omega-6 relative to omega-3 is harmful. So that was like the idea that we had from just purely like mechanisms or biochemical pathways and some like basic observational research. But it got clarified much more with high level studies, because like they started doing interventional trials, just giving like omega-6 to people and like measuring various things like inflammatory biomarkers, lipids, actual end outcomes also, not just intermediary biomarkers, but even like end outcomes. So over there, we consistently saw like there's no increased risk. In fact, like those people do a bit better compared to the people who didn't have like higher linoleic acid intake. So that is one kind of evidence. And there's biomarker studies. So there's biomarker studies looking at linoleic acid alone and looking at end outcomes. So the higher the linoleic acid, like the better the outcomes were. Even some of the newer studies, like there's one paper published last year which looked at the omega-6 to 3 ratio, and the researchers found that a high ratio led to bad outcomes. So just on surface value, someone would think like, yeah, shit, look, that's right all along. Like omega-6 is bad for us. But the researchers then broke down both of them individually. Like they looked at omega-3 individually and they looked at omega-6 individually. So both of them individually were like highly protective. The ratio was showing increased risk because the omega-3s are more protective than the omega-6, but both of them were protective overall. So this is just an example of like why it's like very important to understand like the hierarchy of scientific research, because randomized control trials, well-adjusted long-term prospective cohort studies, like these have the most value, and not just like a single one, because like a single one can be kind of influenced by a lot of things. Like the funding source can be like one factor wherein it would like if the researchers are like don't have integrity, or if it's just like one, two authors, on a paper, and there's only one trial in that whole field, it's very, very sketchy to like just like, like believe that result. But in science, we like look for replication. We look for converging lines of evidence. Like if you have one trial out here showing you something, you don't just go with that. There's like Mendelian randomization studies are also like another kind of very important kind of study that's come up in the last 10 years or so, where we can actually see like we can infer causality from that, because they look at people who have like one mutation in a certain gene which is supposed to affect one thing, and then people who don't have that, and then follow those people and adjust for things. And we find that okay, like that particular variant which is affecting like this particular biomarker, like only in that group we're seeing like increased risk. So we ideally want converging lines of evidence, like the genetic studies. So Mendelian randomization studies are basically just genetic studies. Like that's also one way in which we figured out that lower LDL levels are protective, because the people who are born with like genetic mutations which would make them have lower LDL levels, like they would have like drastically reduced cardiovascular disease compared to like people who didn't have that. Then we have randomized control trials, and we have like prospective cohort studies, and you can have like 1 month study from each of these categories also. That's not as powerful as having like a meta-analysis of each of these. So you can have meta-analysis of multiple randomized control trials, and when you see like a collective trend, that adds a lot more certainty, because that's when like some of these other issues get taken care of. And I see like a lot of people just obsessed with funding, and that's a really short-sighted way. And a lot of people also dismiss epidemiology just like that. That's also like a big red flag. I'll tell you why. So the same people who criticize funding, like, and just throw out a study if something's funded from a certain industry, they oftentimes will have a conflict of interest themselves. Like, they'll be selling a certain supplement on the YouTube channel, or, they have something to gain from like their, like they're monetizing the YouTube audience in a certain way, or they might have, like, ultimately, why are we concerned with funding? Because it's all about bias. And like people can have a bias, like even without being funded. Like I know I had a bias, like whenever I bought into certain diet ideologies and I wasn't being like funded, by anyone. So if I was to do if I was a scientist and I had a bias and I had to do a paper, even if I wasn't funded, like, if a scientist is like a carnivore themselves or a vegan themselves, like, despite funding, like their bias can still come into the research. So what we're ultimately concerned about is the bias. The funding is one factor which can influence someone's bias, and we have to apply our logic consistently as well. Like if you throw out studies because of funding, then like your influencer isn't any better, because even he has like certain conflicts of interest with the supplement line he's selling, or with some product he's promoting which he's getting cuts from. So that really helped me to like develop my views on that. And along with funding, like there's various factors, like the same people again who criticize funding, they will appeal to like kind of evolutionary kind of patterns, like humans have always been like this, which is why this is the right thing, or anecdotes, like, okay, I applied this on myself and I saw this. So I don't use my own personal example ever to like convince anyone of anything. Like this is just my N of one, and this is what's worked for me. I see this in practice all the time. Like if I was to give like the same thing I did for myself for someone else who came in with acne, it wouldn't work. Like because everyone's causes, even for the same symptoms, like everyone's causes are radically different. So you have to personalize the treatment according to the evidence for like what they've come in that way. So like funding being one factor, with lower levels of evidence, you have like much more scope for error than like the funding component. Like with just spouting an anecdote, there are so many things you can't control for. You can't control for the placebo effect. You can't control for like different variables. Like people, when they change one thing, they also change like 10 other things at the same time. So that can be confounding the result. Like people have inherent bias. Like you see this a lot with diet camps. Like if you go to some vegan chat room, or you go to like a carnivore chat room, you'll typically only see like people who have seen positive results. Like the people who don't see it are either like shunned by the community, or they don't like express themselves. I know I've done this myself when I was like in both of these camps, because you get like ideologically winded up. You want to be part of a community and stuff, so you're not really going to like say like things that you aren't doing favorably. You'll tend to like be biased towards the positive side of things. So all of these issues and like many more kind of confound lower levels of research, like with just mechanisms or biochemical pathways. Also you'll see like people come and spout like okay, insulin is bad because it will go inside this pathway and it's going to do this to like these biochemical pathways or whatever, and it's going to lead to like a fat cells changing in this way. That's all very, very preliminary research. Like that's what scientists use to get clues to conduct actual human studies based on those clues and test certain hypotheses and things like that. You'll also see people point to population studies, like okay, this country is doing things in this way, so they have better outcomes. Like this is called ecological data, where you'll just see populations and you'll not really like control for any other things, but you'll just see like okay, this country is doing this, so they seem to like have better health. But even that's very short-sighted, because like on a country level, like people are doing 10,000 different things, along with like the one thing that you think is probably making a difference. So that's also like very low level of evidence. Even with observational studies, like if they are well adjusted, like the researchers are actually controlling for different things, then like, I mean, for example, if you do observational study looking at, the effects of, let's say, red meat on like different cancer outcomes. So just looking at an association doesn't tell you much, because those people can be doing 500 things, but the researchers take the effort to adjust for smoking, to adjust for socioeconomic status, to adjust for like drinking and like fast food and a lot of different things. And even after, if you make those adjustments and you still see an association, it does infer like, okay, there's something going on here, like, you should, it's probably causal, but it still needs to be like confirmed, like further. And like there needs to be other kinds of evidence also, like showing us, to increase our confidence in that. A lot of people will worship randomized control trials also. Like there's a lot of people who only look at that and then ignore everything else. So even that's short-sighted, because randomized control trials also have their issues. Like if an RCT is running for like more than 1 year, it kind of becomes like an observation study, because then you're relying on the people to tell you what they did, rather than having them, in like the center and actually like measuring what they're doing. The funding bit is like, I mean, the money it takes to run a randomized control trial is tremendous, because it takes like insane amount of money to run like a long-term randomized control trial. So there are a lot of issues like that, like within like different kinds of, scientific studies. So I've kind of been like just studying this for a long time, even with statistics and how to critically like read papers and different sections, what they mean. Like I've done some courses to actually solidify my understanding in that. So I take like all of this into account and then rank the research accordingly. And I typically, I wouldn't just go if I have like one study pointing to something. I like to see like the higher levels of evidence I cited, like multiple studies from each, category pointing in the same direction. And then it's just good confirmation if even other lower levels of evidence line up. Like for LDL, for example, we have all the higher levels of evidence. But if you look at ancestral populations, you'll also find that they've actually looked at many ancestral populations, and the Australian Aborigines and like, different kind of ancestral populations, hunter-gatherers basically. And you find that they all have like very low LDL cholesterol, which is very surprising to me, because the typical narrative is like, okay, all these ancestral like hunter-gatherer diets, they're all, doing like more animal foods and stuff. So they would be having like sky high LDL, but their LDLs are like somewhere around 50 to 70, which is very like surprising that way. So it's also good when you have these kind of things align, but you want to make your opinions based on like the top levels of research. And yeah, I don't just dismiss studies based on funding. Like funding can be one factor which can influence the methods of the paper. The scientists might, like misrepresent the results in the discussion section, but the method section like is very clear that, their conclusion doesn't line up with like how they actually conducted the trial. So the funding it should just be like a factor which makes you want to analyze the study with more skepticism, not to just like blanketly dismiss it. Because I've seen it many times. If a certain study is funded and it's wanting to like, something is wanting to be biased, you can catch it. Like if you know your stuff and like the knowledge base in the area you're trying to research, you can catch discrepancies and things like that. That's how I make sense of it.
Right. So just a quick time check. So we are at the 1 hour mark. How much time do we have?
Yeah, I mean, go for it. Like, yeah, probably like half an hour, 45 minutes more. I'm good with that.
Awesome. So clearly, we'll probably need another session with you. You're clearly a fountain of knowledge. So we have one audience question here, that is genetic testing mandatory, and in which cases do we need to go for genetic testing?
So in the way in which I do this for everyone, I will just have people start out with like comprehensive blood work. And if someone is passionate about like doing this for life, then the genetic testing is very helpful. And even within genetic testing, we have like a lot of different companies which do this in, I would say, not such a good way, where they're just looking at individual SNPs. So SNPs are single nucleotide polymorphisms. They're basically like mutations in a certain gene which would increase or decrease our risk of something. So those, like just looking at individual variants and then trying to make changes based on that, like that's not really scientific at all. Because like for any given outcome, we have like multiple more genes which affect that. So just looking at one and then inferring something is not really the way to go. So ideally what we want is a polygenic risk score. This is something in genetics where we look at like all the genes which we know of today, which are shown to affect a certain outcome, and then create a collective score based on that. So this is only done with like advanced like big data and machine learning and AI and stuff. But there are some companies who do that, like self-decode. So those risk assessments are much more valuable than just looking at individual, variants and things, which some other companies do. So even if you're like running one, you should do one which is using like polygenic risk scoring. And then even with genetic testing, you can't just make interventions only based on risk assessments. Like you might do someone's genetic test and they might show that they have high risk of cardiovascular disease. So that should just be like a, entry point to make you look at the markers which we actually know are proven in terms of cardiovascular risk. So if I see someone has high genetic risk, I will inquire about their family like history, of course. Let's try to see if there's any associations there. Then I will try to see like the biomarkers I know which are causal in heart disease, not just ApoB and lipoprotein A, but even like insulin resistance, BMI, smoking status, drinking status, fibrinogen levels, neutrophil to lymphocyte ratio. Like there's a lot which we know is like causal in heart disease, even like CRP levels and stuff. So I'll look at all that and then try to get an idea about like their collective risk. Like, okay, they have some genetic risk. It's already happened in their family line, so definitely there's like strong genetic risk over there. There's a genetic component. Is it manifesting in the present right now? That way, like, is there like LDL elevated? Do they have like a high degree of insulin resistance? Do they have like visceral fat? Like all these things that way that you have to look to confirm the genetic risk. And if they line up, then I will tell them like, okay, look, you have genetic risk. It's already manifesting in the present. This means that like your genetics are definitely impacting on your present condition, and this is something you need to be mindful about throughout life. So every 6 months or every like once a year, you should check these few things and make sure that you're controlling them. So that's how I use the genetic data to guide me about long-term health outcomes. Similarly, like a lot of people look at MTHFR testing. So you shouldn't just be giving someone methylfolate or like like B12 and stuff, just looking at their MTHFR report, because they could have some mutations there, but their homocysteine is perfect in the blood test, and they don't have any much symptoms of that. So just based on the genetic test, I won't give someone like interventions. It has to line up with the symptoms and the biomarkers for me to tell them like, okay, this is the genetics are impacting you, so now you have to like be mindful about this throughout life. That way, that's how I approach it.
Right. So Johan, you mentioned that some biomarkers can predict onset of some chronic diseases, maybe autoimmune diseases, much before they show up in the conventional lab reports, right? So in those cases, how do you balance uh, the intervention versus the overtreatment, because they are still not showing up, on the conventional reports? Is there anything like overtreatment?
For sure there is. Yeah, that's a good question. So it depends biomarker to biomarker. So for genetics, like what I explained is true, because genetics won't always result in like an end outcome, because there can be many factors, like there can be undiscovered genes which also affect that area, which we don't know about yet. They might be counteracting the like kind of genes which are problematic, and the net result might be neutral or positive. Like those possibilities are always on the table with genetics. With biomarkers, like some of them we have a very like high degree of certainty about. Like if they're off, then definitely, like even if they're not manifesting a problem in the present, it's almost certainly going to be a problem in the future. LPA is definitely one of them. Like it has multiple like long-term well-validated studies to show that if someone has like high levels from birth, it's going to be a problem. Like a lot of chronic diseases won't show you any symptoms until they're like at very end stage. Like even for CKD or for heart disease, we don't, like even cancer is like asymptomatic for the most part until like later stages and stuff. So you won't know about this until you like test your biomarkers and interpret them in the correct fashion. So for biomarkers, again, it comes down to like knowing your biomarkers very well and understanding like what they infer. Like if someone has high CRP levels, someone is insulin resistant, like these things we know for sure, like they are increasing risk. And then there are certain markers which don't have like so much research behind them. Like there's a couple of them, like different platelet kind of subdivisions, like PDW, MPV, like and many other things. Like they don't have as much research as we do for certain markers that way. So firstly, it's just about getting an idea about which markers are the most solid, And then from that, like you want to, for the markers which are the most solid, then you want to really focus on optimizing them. Like, for example, someone's albumin levels, like albumin is a really, really, really well studied marker, which has like, more than 20, 30 studies like showing that if you go low, then it's a serious problem. And the lower you go, like the more, problem it is, because albumin typically declines in chronic inflammation, and like even with certain deficiency of protein and things like that, it can, go down. So that's something we know, like if you improve it, then you're certainly going to improve outcomes, even if you don't have any symptoms in the present. The omega-3 index is like a very, very, very powerful, test, because we know, like, even if you don't have symptoms, like if your omega-3 index is low, your chance of dying from a heart attack and having other, like, issues because of having low omega-3s is like really, really high, so that's something that we definitely want to optimize. Blood pressure also, like, it's not going to give you any symptoms, but if your blood pressure is like above 120/80, that the risk just keeps like going up. Like if you go to 130 by, like this thing, you'll have like certain increase in risk. If you go even higher, like the risk keeps going up, and it's not really going to show you like much symptoms, so that's some of these things, like even if they're totally like not giving you symptoms, like your ALT, AST, we know that if they're high, like they're indicating, liver damage. So yeah, it's just about knowing like which biomarkers are solid and then which ones don't have so much research behind them, and not clubbing it all together, which can only happen, of course, if you spend like a couple of years studying this. But this is what I basically like teach, in my courses and things, because I've been studying this for years, and I really want people to have like a crystal clear understanding of the diagnostic template and things. So yeah, that's another example would be VO2 max. Like we know that like low VO2 max levels are very, very bad for a lot of outcomes. Like they've even done studies comparing smoking to VO2 max and other like things like risk of cardiovascular disease and things. So VO2 max is like a very, very important metric. It's basically indicating like how much oxygen you can uptake maximally in a, in a certain kind of breaths that you take to spread to your organs and stuff. So just improving that can add like couple of years more to your life. Like we know that from a lot of like really good research which has been done on the subject. Even like neutrophil to lymphocyte ratio, there's a lot of research showing that the higher it goes. And like some of these markers I'm like, kind of mentioning, it's not just based on 1-2 studies. Like there are some markers which you'll just have 1-2 studies on, which I won't have so much, like, they come lower down in the priority list. But some of these ones like albumin, NLR, omega-3 index, like a lot of the other things I said, like ApoB and stuff, they have like multiple, like 20, 30, sometimes like 40 studies, like all kind of showing the same thing again and again and again that way. So that's when it becomes really solid, because you have different researchers in different countries, like, different populations, but you keep coming across the same result. The reference range is also, many times I'll see that, like, one research group will do a study in this population, the reference range they'll find is like so much. Another group will do it in another country, and they'll find like exact, same reference range. That have the ton of confidence, because there's like different groups, different populations, but you get the same number, like despite, it being that way. So you can even rank the biomarkers in that way, which is what I've done. Like at least mentally I'm aware, like I'm in the process of doing it like physically now. So at least for the ones which have like that level of evidence, I will like really be hardcore about like wanting to optimize them, because I know it means a lot. And then some of the other ones, like they're more experimental, like, and it also depends on how much they're outside. So I have a color grading system in my like analysis template. Like someone comes to me and some of their biomarkers like orange, they're a bit suboptimal. So it's not so important to fix them, because all of us are going to have like a bit suboptimal here and there, because we're all living in the modern world. We have a bit of stress, and our lifestyles aren't perfect. We are not so like perfect with the diet, like a lot of times. So those things like a little bit suboptimal here and there is fine. But then if someone has like proper reds, and that marker is like very well established and has the level of evidence I'm talking about, then I will certainly like give interventions, to fix it. And the interventions also have to be evidence based. Like a lot of people will give interventions based on cell studies and animal studies and biochemical pathway theories and stuff. So that can come in the category of overtreating, because you're giving stuff that's not even been shown to like affect outcomes. So I don't just look at studies which will affect the biomarker, but I will like I have a way of converging the randomized control trials with the observational studies. I like to see that. So I will try to find associations with a certain marker showing increased risk. And then I will always try to find if an intervention is not just improving the marker, but it's also improving the symptoms or the actual disease. Like for example, zinc levels in acne. So zinc levels will like, they seem to be low in acne patients. So if I was just looking at a study on serum zinc, and I found research showing that low zinc levels correlate with like acne intensity, if I was to just treat with zinc based on that, it's not as like evidence-based as me also having trials which show that actually giving zinc to acne patients improves acne, which we also have. So ideally, I try to combine like the interventional studies with the association, with the observational studies. That gives me a lot of confidence that I'm not over-treating, and like I have, like multiple lines of evidence supporting that. Yeah, that's how I go about it.
Right. On the diet side of things, you tried practically all the diets. You've gone from vegan to carnivore and everything in between, right? So this might come off as a stupid question, but regardless, what do you think? What do you think is a good diet, or where do you think is like the optimal diet lies?
No, man, this is a perfectly like I wanted to speak about that actually because I've like really like solidified my understanding on that a lot in the last couple of months. So the most evidence-based diet in terms of actual outcomes, when I say actual outcomes, I mean like there's probably no diet which has like multiple randomized controlled trials. I'm not even saying observational studies, but multiple randomized controlled trials, not just short term, but even lasting like 1 to 6 years in duration, showing improvements. And that's the Mediterranean diet, hands down. Like that's the only diet for which we even have meta-analysis of randomized controlled trials for cardiovascular disease specifically. So that's the kind of dietary pattern that I recommend like anyone who comes to work with me, or even in like my public facing content. Like that's something I will recommend. There's a lot of ifs and buts. Like people take that assuming that okay, I can just do this, and if it doesn't work for me, then like Johan's wrong about like what he said, or the science is wrong. It doesn't work that way. Like we all have individual differences. Some of us may have like IBS or some kind of gut disorder, and we might not be like able to do well with that level of fiber in the diet, or like someone might have some like rare condition which some foods might be contraindicated, or they might have some food sensitivities to like certain foods in those diet, but then they like implement everything and they don't feel so good, so they tend to like demonize the diet as a whole rather than thinking that okay, there might be like one or two things within that. Like I'll give you my own example. You all saw like I was reacting to coconut and dairy, so now on that basis if I just like demonize the carnivore diet or even like the vegan diet for having coconut, I'd not be like really being intellectually honest, because it was only that food like within that which was like triggering my symptoms to that extent, but everything else was fine. But I'm not going to know that until I sit and like isolate variables and like try to find out like which one was doing the problem. So that's just like a broad way to think about this. Like there are certain dietary patterns which we see consistently in long term like cohort studies and even in randomized controlled trials that are beneficial. It doesn't mean it's going to work for everyone. That's a template that we want most people to come in for wide variety of reasons. I can go within the individual foods within these diets also and tell you like why the biochemical or mechanistic basis through which they are exerting their effects. Whether you look at like fruit and vegetable consumption, whole grain consumption, like seafood, some good quality dairy options like yogurt and stuff. Like all of these foods are associated with positive outcomes, like even fermented food, individual food groups, like if you take fruits, if you take vegetables, if you take whole grains, if you take like nuts, seeds, if you take seafood consumption, like fermented food, like you'll find interventional trials on all of these, even like omega-6, rich foods and stuff. Like you'll find actual interventional trials looking at changes in biomarkers and like some changes in like some long-term risks, where we see like individually these foods like like lower inflammation, or they like improve insulin sensitivity, and they help with weight loss or like something. So if you look at it, depends on how deep you want to go. If you want to like go individually into each of these foods, we can just have like a 5 hour long conversation on that itself. But overall, as a dietary pattern, that's what I like recommend overall. And then there are always exceptions. Like someone might have issues with histamine, so then they like have to kind of there are many foods within that diet which would be like high in histamine. If someone has issues with oxalate toxicity, or they have like kidney stone risk formation, then like we might have to restrict like high oxalate foods a bit. But then even within that, there are a lot of nuances. Like most like the entire like keto carnivore side of things, they've just like made this whole culture out of demonizing like plant anti-nutrients. So a lot of them like then they're not really as problematic as we think, or they're problematic for certain subgroups. And there are various factors which also affect them which aren't diet related. Like we can take oxalates as an example. So oxalates are like one plant like anti-nutrient found in certain foods in high amounts, like spinach, dark chocolates, things, sweet potatoes, things like that. So it's not just the dietary oxalate content that's impacting like your urinary oxalate excretion, which is like the best kind of way to assess oxalate. Like a 24-hour urine oxalate test is the one that's used in the studies looking at like oxalate and its impacts. So there's also like the amount of calcium you're having with every meal. So if you're having like calcium along with that, we also have certain gut bacteria which digest oxalate, like Oxalobacter formigenesis. So if you don't have that in your gut, also then like your oxalate formation will be high. If you're having high amounts of vitamin C, if you have a B6 deficiency and you're having collagen, there's like everything gets that granular. If you like just zoom into it, like you'll find different things which affect that particular thing you're concerned about, which don't have much to do with the food that you're so scared about to begin with. Same thing with like phytates and like tannins and stuff. They're also demonized for like being plant anti-nutrients. But with this whole conversation, I've seen that most of the influencers are focused on the deficiencies, and they don't seem to have like much of an idea about like the toxicity side of things. Because I see this in my practice all the time, like people eating heavy animal-based diets and like not like having balanced diets overall. They'll come in with iron overload. They'll come in with like zinc toxicity, selenium toxicity, and it won't be picked up in conventional reference ranges, right? Like selenium, for example, if we take, it's thought to be like a really like a wonder supplement and like a mineral also that way. And people think that it's really good, like even there's no like upper threshold for that. But we see clearly in the studies like going above 150 is shown to increase like diabetes incidence and stuff, like regardless, like multiple studies like aligning with that. So I see this all the time that way, like people will come in. Iron overload is like a very, very nasty thing, because it like by itself, it can cause low testosterone, it can screw up your thyroid, it can screw up your liver, it can cause like high inflammation, insulin resistance, like all the things we are scared about. And we try to like a lot of people try to eat animal foods for, they can induce an iron overload kind of situation and land up with all of those things, like which don't have anything to do with the food. It's just because like the iron is accumulating, and then like hemochromatosis kind of presentation will impact, because iron itself damages different organs. Like it damages the pancreas, it damages like the pituitary, it damages like different things through which like these impacts land up coming that way. So yeah, I don't even see like prudent basis for demonizing certain food groups. Like even phytates and tannins and all, they have their place. Like they help to like reduce the absorption of some of these things, which can be bad for someone who's like doesn't have a good quality diet or something, but it can be protective for someone who has like overload. So it's all about knowing like the functions and the utility that each food group provides, and then accordingly being able to use that in a clinical setting to improve outcomes that way. Yeah, so those are just like there's always nuances to like diet and individual application and stuff, but broadly I want people to come in that kind of pattern, because that's the best that we know for long-term health outcomes. You might do a diet in the short run and you might feel great, but it doesn't really like comment on the long-term impacts. Like you can smoke and you can like see you'll have some weight loss if you start smoking, and you might feel good energetically because the nicotine, it doesn't really mean like it's the best for long-term health outcomes. So I see diets in a similar way. Like someone can get on a certain diet which is very restrictive and eliminates a lot of food groups, and they feel better, but that it's not going to translate into like better long-term health outcomes. Yeah, that's how I see it.
Right. So one of the arguments people, since you mentioned a lot about carnivore and all that, one of the arguments these people make is that historically our ancestors were hunter gatherers. We were living off meat, so we are by nature more carnivorous. So that's the argument these people make. What are your thoughts on this?
So if you look at paleoanthropology, these people tend to cherry pick like one or two of them, who were like Mickey Bendor or like someone like that, who are like very kind of pro animal based overall, and they'll tend to like focus on that. And it's certainly not debated within those circles. Like we've definitely like evolved to like we've had animal foods and evolved. That's not in question that way. It's not like a debatable point or something. Like most of paleoanthropology, there's a consensus that we've eaten animal foods, but we've also eaten plant foods. Like we're omnivores, according to like if you see like the majority of like the field and like where the scientists kind of lean in their opinion. So we've definitely evolved to eat both plant groups, and I find it short-sighted to rely on like ancestral and evolutionary arguments, because I mean, imagine like people in today's world criticize epidemiology, where we are actually trying to assess what's going on in the present. There's extensive data collection. People criticize food frequency questionnaires because like the common criticism is that you can't remember like once what you ate last week, but that's not how they're designed. Like they don't ask you like what you ate like 5 days back or something. They're trying to capture your overall dietary pattern. They'll ask you what you ate today. You'll remember like the meals that you had today, and they're validated. So they will do food frequency, like so design food frequency questionnaires, like get the data, then actually like measure after a week or so, like is that aligning with like how they're eating, like with weighted food records and stuff. So imagine like with epidemiology, like a lot of things being so robust, a lot of things like being adjusted, people will tend to say like, okay, an association could be because those people are also drinking more, or they didn't have a good lifestyle or whatever. Like people, like scientists know that they try to like adjust for these things and then try to see like even after making those adjustments, do we still see like the association, remaining? That infers like it's most likely causal, because even after you remove all that, people will dismiss that kind of evidence when it's so robust, like according to me, and like if you think about it. But then you'll tend to rely on like bone residues and things from like like 1,000-2,000 years ago, and try to infer like that. And we can't even like measure, we don't even have like a good idea about like outcomes. Like my worldview on this was really rocked, because I used to believe a lot of this stuff for like a couple of years. But then like when you actually look at the mortality rates of like hunter gatherers, like in like 400 years ago till now, like we've had abysmally low like overall life expectancy. Like most people would die in childhood, and even like if you survived, like your mortality risk per decade of life, like if you look at that, it's much like higher compared to what it is now. So we've definitely like made a lot of advancements with like modern medicine. There are issues, of course. It's not like it's all perfect, but some of these like medical interventions and stuff have been life-saving. Even improvements in sanitation, hygiene, and like a lot of factors have gone into like improving mortality rates overall. But this is why I don't really like think of like ancestral arguments as being like a very high level of evidence. Even if you think of it evolutionary speaking, the only purpose of evolution is to get you past the point of like procreation, that to that age. Like after that, like evolution doesn't have any interest in you really being alive. So like evolution is not going to like factor in long term like health outcomes for like how long you live or whatever. Its only purpose is like there to get you to that point. And it's quite easy to get to that point with like the some of the things which would impact long-term diseases. Like you can do a heavy carnivore like style diet and you can still make it to 30 like or 40 or so. You're not gonna die by then, so it's not gonna make much of a difference to like evolution. And also like if you just think about how we come to conclusions, like we want to granularity, like we want things to be extensively measured and like multiple things aligning. It's very hard to do that with when looking at like older populations. And even with that, as I said, like I gave you one example, but you can find like similar things. Like when you actually look at different hunter gatherers, they're not exclusively doing animal based diets. Like people do eat a broad variety of plant foods as well, if depending on like which population you look at. So it's not like honest to characterize all of them as if they're all doing like high animal based diets. That's not true. There's wide variation. Like some of them are like the Maasai, but you can find contrary examples also of like tribes and stuff who have more plant foods like compared to animal foods, or who are doing more tubers and like things like that. So that is not, there's not like alignment with that. And then by itself as just a field of study, I don't see it like having that high of a like degree of weight in terms of like what we can infer from it, because of all the issues I mentioned. I see it as a good thing. Like, see, I'm not saying like ancestral evidence, like anecdotes, these things aren't worthless. Like, a lot of scientists also like, they might come across as saying like, or implying that you should just like throw these things out or they don't make a difference. Aisa nahi hai. Like these things are good for like generating good hypotheses. And a lot of the ideas that we get from this level of like, evidence, when we test it, they land up like quite a few of them land up coming true as well. But we have to look at it in that fashion. Like it's just good for curiosity and generating a hypothesis, but that has to be tested further, because there's a long way from like going from an anecdote or from like an ancestral hunch to coming towards causality. Like we have to conduct like multiple studies to test and rule out different kinds of things. You have to rule out different variables, you have to rule out the placebo effect. There's a lot of like steps you have to perform to get to a higher degree of confidence that this is X is actually doing Y, rather than X just being associated with Y. Yeah.
So, Johan, given your transition from a ideology-based diet approach to a more evidence-based Mediterranean diet approach, how do you help your clients transition from their different dietary approaches to probably the Mediterranean ones, given that, people see short-term symptom improvements in any diet because they're eliminating junk and stuff like that. But how do we balance between short-term symptom improvements to long-term health outcomes?
Yeah, so firstly, like just talking about the long-term health outcomes, that's what the components of the Mediterranean diet are there to do. In that, if you look at any like individual food group, as I said, and if see for long-term kind of understanding, we can only rely on prospective cohort studies when it comes to diet. So firstly, within diet, like it's very hard to do like placebo controlled trials. Like you can do it for like some individual macronutrient or a mineral, like you can, mask foods in a certain way where like if someone might think they're having something when they're having something else. But for overall food groups, you can't really do placebo controlled trials for diet, of course. So when we're talking about long-term health implications, the only understanding we can get about that is from long-term like observational studies, where they will take large groups of people, they will like track, what they're eating with kind of validated food frequency questionnaires, or in some cases, they might even like do actual measurements, like once in a couple of years or so, and then follow them for a couple of decades. And they will make adjustments, like they'll track all the other things, like their smoking, their drinking status, like fiber intake, fruit and vegetable intake, like all these things are tracked, and then they're like adjusted for in statistical models. And then we see like after making those adjustments, do certain food groups and the quantity of them you eat associate with better health outcomes. So we know with this kind of research, like fiber intake, fruit and vegetable intake, like seafood consumption, like these things are unanimously like multiple studies like this showing that consistently we see benefits, like even for protein, more so for plant protein than for animal protein, we see consistent like long-term kind of improvements in different health outcomes. So that's the evidence that is going behind like recommending a Mediterranean diet from a long-term standpoint. And even the randomized control trials, as I said, not just for cardiovascular disease, but even for like all cause, like not all cause mortality in a short-term trial, but there are various outcomes which are looked at for improvements like Alzheimer's disease. There's some like interventional trials with the Mediterranean diet, and like a couple of other health outcomes also, like insulin sensitivity, body weight. There's like trials looking at interventional studies showing benefits with that kind of dietary approach. Just give me a second, sorry. Yeah, so that's the evidence that I use to like make that recommendation. And in terms of helping people transition, a lot of times people will have issue because they might react to a certain food group. So I mean, just from my clinical experience, like most people who come to me, they already have like plant foods and stuff included in the diet. So if someone has serious autoimmune issues and stuff, my recommendation, like typically from a dietary perspective, is to try an elimination diet at some point, like try to eliminate certain foods and reintroduce. So you can find your triggers, but it's that's just like a transitionary thing. You want to find your triggers and stuff. And even with that, like a lot of foods, you can actually improve your tolerance to. Like my reaction to coconut and dairy is nowhere near close. Like it's probably 20 or 30% compared to like what it used to be, couple of years back. So a lot of food sensitivities also improve because there are various factors which help us to, like tolerate these foods better. Like some people have undiagnosed gut infections, and because of that, they're reacting to certain foods. And if you do a good job with like clearing the gut, they'll be able to tolerate certain foods in the future. There are different cells in the body that help to build resilience, like T regulatory cells. So if they are increased, like you can improve, like food tolerance to certain things. So a lot of people also think of like if you have food sensitivity, it's there for life. But I've seen this again and again. Like some clients, like I've worked with, they've reacted to eggs, but then I gave them certain intervention, then they started like tolerating eggs again. So it goes both ways that way in terms of like tolerance. So I would recommend something like that. And then my recommendations for diet are different. I don't recommend the Mediterranean diet to everyone, but someone comes with IBS, like some kind of a low FODMAP diet, or someone has like issues with allergies, and like I know for sure they have issues with histamine, I'll recommend them like a low histamine diet. But for general people who come with like mild to moderate symptoms and some issues are not there, then I want them to follow that. Even the people who have health issues, I will tell them like, overall, you want to come back to this after we fix your health issues. It's not like you want to go with this for the long run. And people will typically have a problem with increasing their fiber intake. Like if they've not really eaten fiber, because we have like certain species of bacteria in our gut, which help us, which feed on these like compounds. And because of like long-term antibiotic use or different factors, because of which they might not be present, like the mother's microbiome, you're not having them, or like XYZ, like there are many factors which affect kind of different species of bacteria in our gut. So for whatever reason, if you don't have them and you land up like giving them a lot of fiber, you will actually make things worse for them, because they don't even have the like bacteria to be able to digest like what you're giving them. So it's going to cause them issues. Like we even know this with some interventional studies now, where they give people like fiber, like they're doing a fiber intervention, and there were like 3 kinds of outcomes within the group, in the intervention group. So like 1/3 of those people saw lowering of inflammation with increasing fiber. 1/3 saw like no, like baseline, like no change. But then 1/3 of the group actually saw like an increase in inflammation after they increased their fiber intake. So this is what I mean when I say there are always like individual, variability that way, because even you can find certain studies with the carnivores will cite where people eliminated fiber and their constipation went away. But you have to be intellectually honest. You can't like cherry pick like one evidence and then ignore like everything else on the subject. When we have like so much like strong evidence for fiber, like improving constipation in like 50 different trials, but you want to cherry pick that one where there was a certain subgroup who wasn't probably doing well with that, and then say like fiber is not necessary for humans. That's the issue I have. Like you have to like represent the evidence in totality, not just like kind of ignore certain studies and base your views on one. So with that kind of approach, also scientists are trying to now figure out like, okay, is there some kind of intervention we can give to people before increasing their fiber, which can improve the tolerance? So they're now doing trials with different probiotic strains and fermented foods, and trying to see if we give that before increasing fiber, like does that lead to better outcomes and things like that. So that's typically the problem that I see with someone getting on that kind of approach. And then there's different things that you can do, like typically that's where I'll push them to maybe like go deeper into the microbiome, so we can see like if something's going on there and try to correct that. Or there's different compounds which can improve kind of digestion, so like some of those can be used to reduce IBS symptoms and stuff. So yeah, there's a lot of tools that way, but it depends. Like I customize depending on the patient. Yeah.
Awesome, Johan. So I think that was the last question. Dave, you have anything else?
I don't have any questions as such. So, if any of our audience wants to do the course, I think you have a course now. Would we like? Is there a website or something we can reach out?
Yes. So biohackingindia.in is my like URL. You can go to the courses section. In the course, like it's really comprehensive. Like I've covering like all these 140 biomarkers I spoke about, like the staggered reference ranges for them, evidence-based root causes, how to rule in, rule out, and like how to make sense of everything as a whole, like how to integrate that with symptoms, how to analyze scientific studies, like some of the things I touched upon. But teaching that for a month, like really going into the weeds on like each of the things we've spoken about today, and coming out with like a very solid understanding where it's not ambiguous and there's no like contradictions as such, and everything is kind of you know understood as far as the current science goes. Like that's my kind of like effort that I've made, like whatever science we have right now, to from the best minds, like just to like make all of it very practical and as cheap as possible also, because costs tend to add up over time. Especially if you want to do this for life, then you have to try to make it as cheap while not compromising on the quality or like the accuracy of things. So I've made tremendous efforts to just dial in the right labs, dial in like the right supplement companies, because earlier it used to be very expensive to get these things from abroad. But we have some great supplement companies now which like are validated with third-party tests and stuff, where we can know like, okay, if we're buying like this compound from this company, we're actually getting that without heavy metal contamination. So yeah, that's what there in the course. If anyone's interested, like you can check it out.
That's
So,
awesome.
we like. I have a whole list of questions I wanted to ask, but I'll just wait, save it for the next session. We are having it like, yeah. Whenever you're free, let us know. We'll
Done,
just
man.
do another session, if
Yeah,
not two.
this was fun for me as well. Sure. Great questions.
Thank you. Thanks, Johan, for your time, and appreciate all the knowledge you shared on the Healthy X Sundays podcast. We look forward to see you again. Have a great day. Take care.
You all take care. Bye.